So then, without further delay, we'll get into today's session. The title is Suppressing Foreign Terrorist Fighters and Supporting Principled Humanitarian Action. And this is coming directly from some work that has recently been completed by colleagues at the Program on International Law and Armed Conflict. It's PILAC at Harvard Law School. And I'm very happy to welcome back with us today Naz Modirzadeh, who's the founding director of PILAC at Harvard Law School, as well as Dustin Lewis, senior researcher at PILAC at Harvard Law School. Very happy to welcome both of you back. We're going to begin by giving the floor to Naz to provide a bit of the framing, the context for the research into this subject that PILAC has been conducting, and then Naz will pass along to Dustin to dig into some of the detailed findings. So first, over to you, Naz.
Great. Thank you so much, Inherit. It's a real pleasure to be here, and is always the case with the PHAP events. It's a particular delight to see so many friends and colleagues in the chat room. Greetings to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thanks so much to PHAP for providing us with this opportunity. It's a really unique platform for us to be able to share some of our research and also invite comments, feedback, critique, and questions that we haven't thought of. So I think what I'll do is try to take about 3 to 5 minutes for some framing comments, provide a bit of context for this work that we've carried out on a very specific issue, so kind of give the broader landscape. And then I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Dustin, who carried out the bulk of the legal research for this report, along with our colleague Jessica Bernisky, who was not able to join us today, but did a heroic job of getting into the legal systems of 25 different jurisdictions around the world. And then Dustin will hand it back to me for some, again, broadening out comments on the stakes and on what we think are some of the ways forward on this issue. In general, my hope here is to provide an environment in which we might think about the foreign terrorist fighter question, to get into some of our findings regarding how the law seems to be changing in this arena and what the implications might be for humanitarian action, and then to highlight some of the more very recent developments in this space. So I'm talking kind of the last 8 weeks, and what those might mean moving forward, particularly in light of international humanitarian law. Before starting, I do want to indicate that we were very lucky to have the support of the Norwegian Refugee Council through the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for much of this research, and we're very grateful for that. So let me start with an overview, and again, I'll say apologies. I know there are some of you in the audience who have heard this a number of times. Hopefully it's a useful review. If not, then we will do this very briefly. I want to give a bit of a context. I'm sorry, we're having a bit of a problem with the slides here. I think we're okay now. I want to give a bit of a context for the relationship between counterterrorism law broadly, so this is where we'll be bringing in foreign terrorist fighters in a moment, and humanitarian action. And in our view and in our research on this topic for the past 5 years, I like to think of it as sort of two trends or two trajectories that for about 10 years had very little to do with one another. The first is a real sense in the international community, and particularly in the donor community, that humanitarian action, particularly in the 1990s, moving forward, needed to go beyond life-saving assistance, or sort of what we might see as the bare levels in the IHL treaty documents, and moving towards a much richer, more complex vision of humanitarian assistance, one that required humanitarian organizations and states and armed groups engaging those organizations to engage with one another, and for humanitarian actors to be willing and able to engage with non-state armed groups. I want to be clear here that this is not necessarily all reflected in international law as such, but what we see in a number of Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, Secretary General's reports on protection of civilians, and many donor policy approaches, was a real encouragement that meaningful humanitarian action meant not simply being on the territory and providing services, but being able to engage and negotiate with all parties to armed conflict, including non-state armed groups. At the same time, we see a trend developing from a very different direction. And this is, of course, in the arena of global counterterrorism, if you will. This, of course, existed before the attacks of September 11th, 2001, but certainly what we see in the wake of those attacks is a tremendous global effort to expand counterterrorism law, and we see the Security Council taking a leading role in requiring, under Chapter 7 authority, that every state implement laws and enforcement approaches that would ensure that global terrorists or transnational terrorists were not able to take advantage of loopholes in various territories to accrue wealth, arms, and personnel. And we see a real move in the arena of counterterrorism regulations to focus in not just on terrorist attacks themselves or arms and military training themselves, but also on the idea of support for terrorism. And after Security Council Resolution 1373, which lays out many of the arenas in which the Council is demanding that states implement criminal laws, the Security Council also moves into a much more robust approach to designating particular individuals and armed groups as terrorists, and thereby requiring that all states implement asset freezes and travel bans on those individuals and groups. So what we see is an effort to restrict and regulate support, and that it falls to states to determine what does support for terrorism mean. So some states develop criminal laws that are exceptionally broad in their understanding of support, and others tailor it very narrowly towards things that we might have traditionally seen as being support for terrorism. So our concern and where we came at this research is what happens when these two worlds meet, when these two efforts at global lawmaking, regulation, and policy collide in areas where listed or designated terrorist actors control territory or access to a population in a situation that is an armed conflict, where the civilian population and the wounded and sick require humanitarian assistance. We have on the screen here some of the areas where we have seen these two worlds colliding, if you will. I'll just say a few things about the cases that we have here. If you take an example like Gaza, West Bank, or Lebanon, what you see is a context where a humanitarian organization may be engaging a non-state armed group that is designated as terrorist by some of their donors and by some states and not by others. So when they are entering into the territory, when they are engaging with government-type administrators who also are part of the political branches of a designated group, humanitarian actors increasingly find themselves unsure about where the boundary lines are regarding counterterrorism laws. In other situations, such as Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, humanitarian actors may be operating in an area where there has been a global designation, where the world has said through the Security Council, this organization is terrorist, and there are a number of criminal and other provisions that come from that. And as humanitarian actors negotiate actions such as checkpoint crossings, requests for taxes, requests for registration fees, coordination with representatives of armed groups in order to deliver life-saving assistance, coordination of transport and warehousing in territories controlled by designated groups where they may also control, for example, those who own warehouses and trucking companies. How do humanitarian organizations navigate this situation, and what kinds of risks are posed by counterterrorism laws that don't appear to have been drafted to constrain humanitarianism, but may have that effect in reality. So I'll just run through one example that I find useful in thinking about this issue. It's just one amongst many, and it's meant to be illustrative of the problem rather than taking us deep into the substance of the question. I'll provide this example, and then I'll just sort of transition into the more specific and more recent research regarding foreign terrorist fighters. Here you have the latest iteration of what many of you are familiar with, which is the Security Council Resolution 1612 sort of family of resolutions. So these are the resolutions promulgated by the Security Council that seek to limit and in some cases penalize grave violations against children in armed conflict, 6 specific violations. And it's a fascinating blend of lawmaking and enforcement where the council really seems to want to say, we're going to name those actors who are engaging in these violations, and then we're going to try to come up with a creative toolkit in order to address those violations. And one of the elements of this toolkit is, of course, engagement and the development of so-called action plans. So in articulating the annex of groups and armed forces who are seen as engaging in these grave violations, the Security Council says, listen, UNICEF and humanitarian actors on the ground, one way we think you can end these grave violations is to engage with the violators, work with them to identify tools and possible solutions for these violations, and then come up with action plans to implement those. So one example of this was the effort to limit and indeed end the use of child soldiers by the LTTE in Sri Lanka, and indeed involved many of these more innovative tools. So let's do a quick walkthrough of what it would look like if you were a humanitarian agency or organization that saw itself as having a mandate related to protection of children in armed conflict, wanted to embrace the Council's call here for these kinds of engagements and action plans, and also has a handful of government donors around the world. So if we look first at Australia, this is the terrorist list of Australia. You'll see groups that are sort of not that surprising, I think, for most of us. I'll point out 2 things that are interesting about the Australian list. One is that you'll see that both for Hamas and Hezbollah, Australia actually limits its designation to what are often thought to be the armed elements of these groups, arguably making a point that they are not targeting the political branches of these organizations. They also have the PKK, a number of organizations in Pakistan. This is the Canadian list. So again, we're imagining an organization or agency that has donor contracts with all of these states. The Canadian list is longer. It, in fact, lists a number of organizations as such. So, for example, Hamas is not broken out into different branches. Interestingly, Canada has designated the Taliban, which it may surprise some of you to know that many of the allies in the coalition have not designated the Taliban, including the United States. Many think this is in order to preserve the option of negotiating with the Taliban at the point of some political solution at the end of the conflict. This is the U.S. Foreign Terrorist Organization list. Those of you who are familiar with the U.S. counterterrorism system, of course, know that the U.S. maintains multiple lists that have different domestic and international legal implications, but I'm just going to focus here on the FTO list, which is the most significant for this purpose. A number of organizations that we would expect to see here, and again, a diversity from the other 2. And finally, the United Kingdom. Of course, all countries have recently added ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever one chooses to call them, Boko Haram, and Jabhat al-Nusra, as those were designated by the Security Council. So here is the Security Council's annex from 2013 naming those armed groups and organizations that are thought to be engaging in grave violations against children in armed conflict. And now here is the intersection between all these things, right? So you are the organization that is trying to figure out a strategy for approaching some of these groups through the 1612 framework, right? Engagement, action plans, and yet each of these countries in their contract with you, and if they have criminal jurisdiction over you, in their criminal jurisdiction over you, is saying various forms of support to these groups are both a breach of contract and unlawful under criminal law. And so that's the area where we're interested. Those are the intersections where we want to see what happens when there is this intersection, what are the dilemmas, and then what can be done to solve problems that arise out of what may have been an unintentional overlap between different areas of law. And it's with an eye to this that we decided to look closely at Security Council Resolution 2178, arguably a real sea change in global counterterrorism law. As Dustin will explain to us, a resolution that really in September of 2014 was decided in a global mood of consensus and profoundly shared concern regarding the threat of ISIS in particular. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Dustin to tell us a bit about this research, and then I'll come back with some closing comments.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Naz, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As Naz mentioned, against the broader backdrop of our counterterrorism and humanitarian engagement project, we undertook this research on how states are suppressing foreign terrorist fighters and how they're supporting principled humanitarian actors. So this arose with respect to Resolution 2178, and we'll go through some of the key foreign terrorist fighter-related obligations of that at some point soon. But it's very important to understand the broader backdrop where this is not something that occurred all of a sudden out of nowhere, but fits within much broader trajectories where states, on the one hand, are supporting a normative trajectory whereby they're encouraging engagement with listed and organized armed groups who are in situations of armed conflict, either committing grave violations or otherwise controlling access to civilians in need. And then on the other hand, on the other side of the trajectory, increasingly robust counterterrorism mechanisms aimed at trying to not only punish but also prevent and suppress from the outset what are considered to be, under various legal definitions, terrorist actors. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to try to do 6 things. The first is very briefly discuss the rise of the foreign terrorist fighter concept and how it came about. Next, I'll go into the briefing report that we published in October. And then third, I'll look into a little bit more depth of how exactly we try to measure how states are suppressing foreign terrorist fighters and how we try to measure how states are supporting principled humanitarian action. Next, I'll look at what some of the concerns are that we found in our research for humanitarian actors. Next, I'll look at how some of the ways that we think humanitarian organizations, counterterrorism bodies, security actors, donors, and others might be able to strengthen the evidence basis for policymaking and decision-making in this realm. And last, I'm going to highlight a few of the potential IHL implications that arise between the intersection of this suppression of foreign terrorist fighters and support of principled humanitarian action trajectory. So, in September 2014, President Obama convened at the UN Security Council and the United Nations more generally, one of the first times, I think only the 6th time in history, a head of state, head of government summit. And this one was to address the rising threat of what's been captioned foreign terrorist fighters. So it's very clear that at this time is, as President Obama's quotation here says, the unprecedented flow of foreign terrorist fighters in recent years to and from conflicts. This was the impetus for Resolution 2178. In our research, we divided up the states. We sought a number of states, and I'll tell you very soon exactly how, but we wanted to show that this is not an issue that arises only with respect to some states in the region or some states nearby, but in fact, this has been recognized by the Security Council as a global threat and one that arises in countries around the world where nationals are seeking to travel to conflict zones in order to conduct what are defined under the Security Council as terrorist acts. And here, the slide in front of you shows what we could discern from publicly available data as a proportional distribution of foreign terrorist fighters by nationality for the 25 selected states. So this is unfortunately more art than science in many key respects. We went through all of the numbers that have been produced by government agencies, by UN bodies, and in news reports, and tried to say, of the 25 states that we profiled, how many of their nationals have actually been linked in some way to having met the definition laid out in the Security Council as foreign terrorist fighters. And here you see a wide variety of distribution among the different states, but all of the 25 states that we profile, including major humanitarian donor states, major counterterrorism states, states in the region, and states nearby, have what are considered to be foreign terrorist fighter concerns from their nationals themselves. I'll note quickly that all of these infographics are available on our web version as well as in the report itself, which we can send a link to in the chat. So with the briefing report, in light of our broader work on counterterrorism and humanitarian engagement over many years, we had two goals. The first one was to provide a brief primer on the most salient issues at the intersection of counterterrorism measures and humanitarian aid. And we really wanted to focus, though, on this ascendant foreign terrorist fighter framing, given the impetus of Security Council Resolution 2178 and how that fit within the anti-Al-Qaeda, anti-Taliban Security Council resolutions alongside of the more general Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism obligations more generally with 1368, 1373, and the other ones. The second major thing we wanted to do with this report is to put forward for critical feedback a provisional methodology. And we wanted to do this because we think it might be an interesting and important way to be able to discern what exactly the threat is, what we're able to determine from publicly available sources about it, and then to say whether or not it's meaningful to try to actually quantify or in some way empirically analyze these very, very difficult legal, policy, and operational questions. And we're not sure if we got it right, but we very much invite critical feedback on this provisional methodology. I want to underscore here, and I underscore it in the PowerPoint, that this is a provisional methodology. It's one that by no means final or absolute, and one that has a lot of key caveats here. So one of the main ones is that we had around 2 months to do most of the research, and my colleague Jessica Berniski and I conducted a lot of the underlying research for this. One of the caveats is that we didn't have access to all of the we don't read all of the different languages in which all of the 25 states we profiled would have their jurisdiction, so we were relying on English language or some other language translations for some of those. In addition, we looked primarily at black letter law and then news reports, and so of course anyone who studies law knows that's not only what the law in the books is, but also of course how that law is given effect by the judicial, executive, prosecutorial authorities, and yet our review of a lot of these legal considerations is one that's primarily based on the black letter law. This is an important caveat and a big limitation to some of the findings. Of course, we're not experts in all the 25 different jurisdictions, and we invite comments, critical comments on our approach to those jurisdictions and what we may have missed with the ones for which we don't have as firm of a grasp as some of the other ones. So what do we actually mean when we're talking about foreign terrorist fighters here? In international law, there's no generally agreed definition of what constitutes a terrorist act or what then constitutes a terrorist. However, you can resort to international legal definitions from international conventions. You can also look to Security Council Resolution 2178 on the foreign terrorist fighter piece, or to domestic law itself. So although there is no generally agreed definition of what is considered a terrorist, you can resort to legal analysis to determine from an international treaty, some Security Council resolutions, or domestic laws what exactly we mean when we say a terrorist or a foreign terrorist fighter. Here we look at the definition from 2178 of what a foreign terrorist fighter is, and the Security Council promulgated the following. It's a national who travels or attempts to travel to a state other than their state of residence or nationality, and other individuals who travel or attempt to travel from their territories other than their states of residence or nationality. And here's the key piece: for the purpose of the perpetration, planning, or preparation of, or in participation in, terrorist acts, or the providing or receiving of terrorist trading. Of course, this raises the question of what exactly a terrorist act is, and then you need to resort to other legal frameworks to discern the content exactly of the terrorist act. But underscore here that it's for the purpose of the perpetration of some sort of terrorist act or to receive terrorist training. How did we select the states? We had limited resources, so we only looked at 25. We looked at the P5 states. These are ones that, of course, are very important in terms of promulgating counterterrorism norms. We looked at states that had the highest reported numbers of foreign terrorist fighters per capita. We also brought in states that have the largest humanitarian donations to Iraq and Syria. And last, we looked at border states, the ones given that those might be particularly susceptible to the concerns around foreign terrorist fighters transiting through them. Ultimately, the 25 states we selected are the ones on this map based on those 4 sets of criteria. So how did we break it down? We tried for the first time, so far as we could tell, to actually measure from an empirical perspective or a quantitative approach here with all of those caveats in mind, exactly the extent to which those 25 states are suppressing, in line with Resolution 2178, foreign terrorist fighters. So how did we do that? We broke it down into 5 distinct categories and then gave 20 percentage points for each one of those 5 categories. The categories are derived from the counterterrorism FTF obligations entailed in Resolution 2178, read in light of the other resolutions in these tracks, including the 1267 and 1373 regimes. The first one is whether or not states are actually preventing and suppressing foreign terrorist fighter travel. The next one is whether states have penalized under domestic law, in line with the obligations entailed in the resolution, foreign terrorist fighter conduct. The third set of obligations we tried to review was whether states had penalized funding, in particular, to foreign terrorist fighters. The fourth set of obligations we tried to review was whether or not states had penalized the facilitation and recruitment of foreign terrorist fighters. And the last one is we looked at whether states had brought to, quote, justice, end quote, foreign terrorist fighters, given that this is one of the explicit obligations entailed in the Security Council resolution. So the skeptical among you might be saying, how could you actually have in any way meaningfully analyze these different things? These are very disparate sets of obligations. They're very hard to actually measure. I totally agree, but we thought it might be meaningful in some way to at least put forward a provisional methodology to try to assess these things and see what we could actually find from publicly reported sources, given that the Security Council and many states outside of the Council are saying foreign terrorist fighters are an incredibly important issue for international peace and security, and if they are that important, then we should be able to find at least some of the things that states have done to try to suppress them in line with those different obligations. So what we found is the following. These are also available in the report and in both the online and PDF versions of them. Here's how we broke down, and here's how we assessed within those 10-point scales, 10 points for each one of those different sets of obligations, whether the states under review had given effect to their counterterrorism obligations entailed in Resolution 2178. You'll see a lot of diversity within the states in terms of these assessments. And again, I would just bear emphasis that there, for all the caveats that we had before, given that we weren't able to always do primary language research with respect to all of the different jurisdictions, and we may have missed some. But from publicly available sources and from from all the different laws that we could find, here's how we saw the range of ways that states have actually undertaken their foreign terrorist fighter obligations 1 year out on Resolution 2178. A key note here is that we didn't look only at new laws that have passed in light of or after 2178, but also looked to see if states had already laid down in their domestic frameworks, if they'd already taken the actions necessary to comport with the resolution requirements from the 1267 anti-Al-Qaeda and the 1373 more general counterterrorism prohibitions. But as Naz had mentioned before, we also wanted to look within this broader framework not only about the extent to which states are suppressing terrorists, foreign terrorist fighters, and others deemed a security threat, deemed a threat to international peace and security, but also at the same time how states are supporting principled humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts. Given that the role of humanitarian actors is one of great importance and one where they're where they're key battlefield actors today, we wanted to juxtapose the extent to which states are on the one hand suppressing foreign terrorist fighters, and on the other hand, the extent to which those same states are trying to support principled humanitarian action in counterterrorism contexts. How did we try to go do this? This was even a little bit harder from a methodological perspective than the suppression piece. We tried to break it down again into 5 different buckets or categories, and for each one we gave 10 points or 20% overall for the extent to which states were doing this. It's very hard to break down into a quantitative perspective exactly how much states are supporting principled humanitarian action, and some people would say that this is actually an impossible endeavor and one that is not susceptible to meaningful empirical analysis. This is our best take at trying to do that so far, and again, we invite very critical feedback on it. So what were the 5 big categories? The first one were the anti-terrorism lists knowable? So was that state's anti-terrorism list knowable, given that all states have to comport with Resolution 1267, the anti-Al-Qaeda list, which right now I believe is around 320 people, 77 different organizations. All countries are required to give effect to that list. How knowable were those lists for humanitarian actors, whether from a humanitarian donor perspective or a sending state perspective or an actual state in the region that are directly affected by the presence of foreign terrorist fighters? Second one was whether there was how easy it was to navigate and what the efficiency of the regulatory system was for humanitarian actors. This is one of the most difficult ones to actually align with a quantitative perspective. We relied heavily on the great work being done by the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, but I imagine that if we were able to widen the lens and include other inputs as well, we might have an even more sort of keen analysis of exactly what the main determinants were for that ease of navigating this regulatory system. The third one was whether or not there was any explicit exemptions for principled humanitarian action in domestic law. So here we were trying to assess whether countries, in line with their IHL obligations, in line with their humanitarian policies, had laid down alongside of the counterterrorism obligations any explicit exemptions for principled humanitarian actors. One issue in particular, one way to look at this is medical care in armed conflict. IHL obviously allows under certain treaties, including Additional Protocol 1, Additional Protocol 2, that no one should be punished for having provided medical care or assistance to anyone so long as that medical care is provided during an armed conflict and is provided in accordance with medical ethics. Yet some states' counterterrorism laws actually sweep in what might otherwise be protected medical care. So we were looking to see how states actually balance these considerations and whether there are any explicit exemptions. One big potential issue in our research was that some states might not need an explicit exemption, which we note in the research, and we weren't exactly certain then what to do with that consideration for the sort of totaling up the points. The fourth one was whether there were any reported counterterrorism-based adverse legal proceedings or counterterrorism-based chilling effects from a specific state's counterterrorism laws for principled humanitarian actors. Having done research on this for a long time, we've often heard from humanitarian organizations that there's a chilling effect or that otherwise that some states' counterterrorism obligations and other counterterrorism measures have a negative impact on humanitarian actions, humanitarian access and assistance, protection of civilian activities, other things. But when you actually try to assess it from publicly available documents, it was really hard for us to find a lot of very detailed sense of adverse impact in ways that we could actually quantify. That's not to say, of course, that there aren't really good reasons why humanitarian organizations wouldn't wouldn't have these adverse impacts, but would be a bit afraid to actually come out and say this with respect to specific states, given security concerns, given humanitarian donor concerns, and others. But it's very hard for us to track down, and it's an area where we think humanitarian organizations could do more work in developing a evidence basis on which to effectively make policy in this area. And the last one, in terms of whether states were supporting principled humanitarian action in counterterrorism context, was whether it was a pure number question, whether they provided financial support for humanitarian action in Iraq and Syria in the first half of 2015, given that Iraq and Syria were two of the territories that were most affected by this foreign terrorist fighter concern, and then we looked at that in terms of proportional distribution based on population. And then here's what we found. So again, raising the general question, is it even possible to meaningfully reduce all of these qualitative concerns to quantitative figures, right? These are very difficult issues. They involve overlapping legal obligations, overlapping policy concerns. Are they actually susceptible in some way to meaningful empirical analysis? This is our first take at it, and you'll see, again, a huge range of numbers in the ways that states actually support principled humanitarian action. The one that might jump out to a lot of viewers is that there's only 4 instances where we found explicit exemptions to counterterrorism laws for principled humanitarian action, and for the most part, we found none. Again, though, that might just be because the states didn't need to, given that their counterterrorism laws might not necessarily sweep in that type of action, so query whether or not we may have just missed that or just miscast that in some important way. But here, you just see huge diversity of approaches that states are taking to supporting principled humanitarian action in these counterterrorism contexts. All of this is occurring against the backdrop of broader legal and policy considerations. In 2011, the ICRC called for states in its challenges report to exclude from the ambit of counterterrorism offenses activities that are exclusively humanitarian and impartial in character and that are conducted without adverse distinction. The ICRC did that again in its challenges report from this year, from this last October. So what did we find on the horizon for the principal humanitarian organizations? And if you'll just bear with me, I'm going to be talking for another 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll hand it back over to Naz. There's 6 big things that we thought humanitarian organizations might see on the horizon in light of the research that we did. Given the perception of the security risk and the policy concerns around foreign terrorist fighters, we anticipate that there might be heightened administrative and programmatic burdens on humanitarian organizations due to the travel restrictions that some states are formulating in light of these concerns, especially Australia. There might be decreased freedom of movement of humanitarian personnel. There could also be increased governmental scrutiny of national and regional staff. Again, not only with respect to the FTF considerations, but within this broader framework of counterterrorism and humanitarian engagement. Fourth, there might be some decreased access to financial services and funding channels, not only from humanitarian donors being less willing to put forward money, but also banks themselves de-risking the situations, de-risking financial flows into regions of concern. Fifth, we anticipate that there might be elevated concerns regarding reputational harm. When you're living in an age of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, it's very easy for a tweet to get sent around the world very quickly, where without sufficient context, it might be difficult to understand why a humanitarian organization is operating with respect to certain armed, non-state armed groups, especially those designated as terrorists, perhaps particularly those with foreign terrorist fighters associated with them, to try to distribute relief and humanitarian aid and assistance in areas controlled by those groups. And the last one that we anticipate on the horizon for humanitarian organizations is a potential decrease in autonomy of action with respect to engagement here. So will they actually be able to have the support of donors and other of the states of the in the region on the ground and with their donor states of actually engaging with all parties to armed conflict, given the importance of that right of humanitarian initiative, as it's called, entailed in Common Article 3 and sort of at the root of much of the normative framework underlying today's principled humanitarian action. We are keen as researchers to try to develop evidence on these issues and try to come from a standpoint of actually having an assessment for evidence base and the evidence base to make decisions at the policy level. 2 big ones we wanted to flag with respect to the Security Council, given that it has an increasingly important role in this. It's not only, of course, treaties and customary law, but the Security Council in some ways is one of the most important normative influencers in this region, in this area, is that we recommend that that the assessments of state compliance with binding Security Council counterterrorism measures are made publicly available. Already there are the UN Security Council Executive Directorate and other bodies that go and do these assessments. For political reasons, they might be too sensitive to make publicly available, but I think that there's an important conversation that should be had as to whether or not whether the public policy concern around the counterterrorism threat is sufficient to actually want to be able to publicly evaluate the extent to which states are undertaking these obligations in line with their Security Council obligations, and then, of course, their international human rights law, international refugee law, and international humanitarian law obligations. The other one with respect to the Security Council is we think it might be useful, although other people disagree, to foster discussion and try to develop consensus on what it means to actually comply with IHL, international human rights law, and international refugee law when states have to give effect to these Security Council counterterrorism obligations, and then to actually say publicly what some of those are. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Modirzadeh, to discuss a little bit more some of the thinking that we've seen and discussions that we're hearing about humanitarian exemptions.
Thanks very much, Dustin. I'm going to keep it brief so that we have time for discussion and Q&A. We've had a lot of good discussion in the chat area as well as in the Q&A section. I did want to note, Pedro was kind enough to flag the brand new, hot off the presses NRC toolkit on this issue, and I'd certainly recommend those of you who are unfamiliar with this document and are interested in these questions to look at how that document approaches the question of risk management and counterterrorism measures. I will just say two quick things here, building off of what Dustin's just concluded on. One is the question of exemptions is one that I think will be important for the humanitarian community and the security community, but does not lend itself to obvious answers. So we've certainly witnessed that in the humanitarian community, there are very strong and very different views on this question. Some seem to believe that legal exemptions, so carve-outs for humanitarian action in existing laws or new Security Council resolutions or laws that would sort of make it clear retroactively that existing sanctions should not be applied to humanitarian organizations. Some are of the view that this is really the main strategy for solving this dilemma. Others feel equally strongly, as far as we can tell, that there are risks to that approach, that humanitarians should insist that their work is already protected. And I've even heard some innovative arguments that suggest that, for example, operational paragraph 5 in Security Council Resolution 2178, which, as Dustin noted, talks about compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights law, itself actually functions as an exemption when applied. So I just wanted to highlight that. We can certainly talk about it more in the discussion, but it's an area where even in the last few weeks, as we've been involved in both public and closed forums on this question, I think we're really seeing this is going to be a tough issue for the humanitarian community to achieve consensus, but I think a really vital discussion to have on this question. I'll just close with some of the really new dilemmas that we're seeing as states implement Security Council Resolution 2178 domestically and as they take these broad guidelines from the Council and figure out how they think it should affect their domestic law. One is of what will happen with individuals who return from places such as Syria and Iraq, but I think mostly Syria at this point. They are citizens or legal residents. They come back to their home state, and they claim as a defense against prosecutions under FTF-related laws that they were providing humanitarian or medical services in the field. They do not say they were working for WFP or for SAVE. They say, I went and I volunteered to carry out humanitarian activity. How should states respond to that? So should they see this as an activity that is, particularly in the case of medical care, protected by IHL and therefore cannot be penetrated by criminal law and foreign terrorist fighter related laws? Or to the contrary, is the Council actually requiring states to at least prosecute, if not take other measures such as rehabilitation or reintegration measures vis-a-vis such individuals? Second, I think is the really tough question of sort of in what way does the emergence of FTF further complicate, destabilize, blur the relationship between terrorism and IHL. And here I really recommend to those of you who have not had an opportunity to read it, I of course recommend the entire ICRC Challenges report, but in particular the section on terrorism and IHL. I think it's elegantly drafted, and I think that it addresses what is, of course, a legal problem, but perhaps more so almost a kind of existential philosophical dilemma, and query what FTF does to that discussion. Does it further kind of skew the relationships and further blur the lines? Finally, we looked for evidence that new FTF-related laws were limiting travel for humanitarian actors, and at this stage, I think our conclusion is that it's just too early to tell what the implementation of these laws will mean. Many states are even still in the process of crafting their legal systems to reflect these security concerns. But I think overall, there is certainly a question about how states that take their IHL obligations very seriously and their human rights obligations will balance what they see as a legal obligation according to the Council's resolution alongside a series of legal obligations, particularly for those that are joining the coalition against ISIL in a strong enough fashion that they would be considered parties to the armed conflict in Syria and or Iraq. With that, I'm going to close. And Herod, I'll hand it back over to you, and you let me know if we should address some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A, or if you'd like to take a different approach. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Naz, and thanks, Dustin, for the presentation. Yes, I think we've had several really good questions come in, so I think we should take those up. I know, Naz, you've been looking at them on the side during Dustin's presentation, so I don't need to read them out word for word, but let's begin, I think, with Omnea's question regarding actually the legal significance of labeling groups as terrorist groups, and she's thinking from the perspective of a humanitarian organization. Naz, if you want to pick that up first, and then we'll, I think, move on to Robin's question, and then pass it back to me, and we'll see where we stand. So over to you, Naz.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Omnea, thanks for the question. I think it's a really good one and one that we often skip over when we talk about these issues. So I'll just say a few very quick things here. One is it's important to recall there is currently no international law definition of terrorism. So when we say what is the significance of labeling a group as terrorist, I think it's uncontroversial to suggest that this is a political designation and that different states have different perspectives on what it means to be a terrorist and how they classify that. However, once that classification is made for whatever political or other reasons, the main significance, I would say, for humanitarian actors is at least twofold. On the one hand, you are likely to have, and indeed I would say at this point it is almost impossible that you do not have, at least one clause in your grant agreements with donors, private and public at this point, that include obligations regarding prevention of support to terrorism. So it might be a clause that actually sets out the domestic list of a particular country. It might be a clause that references only the Security Council's 1267 list. But a humanitarian organization receiving funds qua humanitarian organization today is exceptionally likely to have real contractual obligations vis-a-vis groups that are designated as terrorists. One. Two, it's likely that you have some protocols regarding due diligence and risk management, and it may be that you have particular ones of those vis-a-vis designated organizations. Given that your risk exposure is higher when you are dealing with those organizations, legally speaking at the very least, if not from a security perspective, then you also are likely to have protocols in place, or your organization may be contemplating putting protocols in place to specifically address that kind of risk. With that, I think comes a guarantee in 2015 that states' degree of scrutiny on operations in areas where designated groups are active is also much higher. So I think it's worthwhile to think about how do groups and individuals get designated in the first place, and what are the due process and other protections in place. But for our purposes, it's highly formalistic. Once a group or a person is designated, it activates a whole series of things on the side of the humanitarian organization. I think what I will do is, if I may, I will just ask Dustin on a question that is not specifically related to FTF, but I think just on this question of prosecutions, and why, to the extent that states might say, well, look at their prosecutorial history. We haven't been going after MSF and ICRC and others. Why is the criminal law question important? Why does it matter if in practice we don't see many prosecutions of humanitarian organizations?
Great, thanks Naz, and thanks for the question. So I think there's a few ways that we need to think about this. One is the actual definitional question of whether or not there have been a lot of prosecutions. This gets to the question of what some people consider to be bona fide humanitarian organizations or not, and whether the domestic legal frameworks are ones that are able to reveal that in any meaningful way. So I sort of just want to parenthetically note that I'm not actually certain how we should assess whether there have been a lot of these prosecutions or not, given that there's little agreement on exactly what a bona fide humanitarian organization is within this context. So what does it mean, though, for this broader question to have a humanitarian engagement, humanitarian action potentially criminalized, especially with respect to foreign terrorist fighters or with respect to other designated terrorists operating in armed conflicts? One thing, and perhaps the biggest one, is that the criminal law is how states are able to telegraph to their own citizens, other people in their territory and other states, what they consider to be morally prohibited. So these are the things where states are saying, this entails moral sanction at the penal level. It is the one that is going to be the most, that we consider as a community to be unacceptable. And so if you say that this thing is unacceptable, whether or not you actually prosecute it, there's already an implication that what you're doing entails moral blameworthiness in some way. And so that's a very important thing. Short of prosecution, of course, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the legal system, states can undertake a number of other actions, whether or not it means not even allowing somebody to ever travel into a state under refugee, asylum, and other laws to bar access even into a country, and also to utilize the criminal law in ways that will never bubble up to the surface so that you won't actually know that a prosecution was ever potentially threatened. So if somebody says, well, actually we have a very strong non-prosecution record on this, that might mean something, but it might mean much less if you aren't able to actually see what's happening behind the scenes, where the prosecutorial authorities are able to utilize the criminal law in ways that dissuade people from undertaking those actions or threaten adverse actions then in other ways. And then the last one, of course, is that it might dissuade donors and others to actually provide that support in terms of funding or other administrative services, and thereby having a chilling effect on this. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Annerid to see if there's other questions we might be able to address.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Dustin, and thanks, Naz. So yes, we have a couple of questions I'd like to bring in, and these are regarding specific contexts. The first is a question from Corey asking the following: how do the speakers consider the conflict, the crisis in Ukraine? Are some of those involved in the conflict considered to be so-called foreign terrorist fighters? is the conflict considered to be a terrorism-related conflict? So that's a first question regarding the Ukraine context from Corey. And then a second question coming from Pedro. Pedro's asking, are we likely to see any exemptions from counterterrorism laws and policies for humanitarian action in Syria? And he's thinking, for example, of the kind we saw in Somalia in 2011. So those two questions, I'll toss them back to you in Cambridge. Perhaps we start with Naz, and then Naz, if you'd like to pass along to Dustin, please feel free.
Great. I will take exemptions for Syria, and then I'm going to pass it over to Dustin to talk about Ukraine. And thanks for raising that, by the way. I think we tend to not talk about situations that aren't focused on ISIS and the Middle East region. So on Syria, it's a great question, and my answer is not what I would have expected my answer to be. For a variety of reasons, I think probably most of them just the reflection of the political alignments in the incredibly complicated situation in Syria. Not only have we not seen exemptions, we haven't seen a demand or a need for exemptions. So what I mean by that is there's very, very little evidence that the humanitarian organizations that faced incredible challenges from counterterrorism law in the Somalia famine response, and there's lots of really good work on this. I'll see if we can plug in a few links. HPG did some work on this, as did the Charity Security Network and others. Those same organizations, I think, have not seen an equivalent of Somalia, where major donors have pulled funding, where major donors have said, you know, we are so concerned about the risk of diversion to terrorist organizations that we're just not comfortable with this particular kind of programming. Indeed, what we're hearing from many operational organizations that have any access is that they are being urged by donors to do more and to take greater risks to deliver in areas controlled by armed groups in Syria. So I read that as being, I think, a reflection that right now many of the donors are providing support to some armed groups in Syria and wish for humanitarian assistance to continue to flow into Syria, and are thus accommodating their oversight, enforcement, and monitoring mechanisms to reflect that political reality. It does not mean, though, and this is important, and I've heard this reflected by many in the humanitarian world, it does not mean that those contracts could not come back later to get you, meaning there are highly restrictive clauses in grant agreements for Syria because of the presence of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, and certainly it is possible that a year or two from now, should foreign policy priorities shift, we could see inquiries or other efforts to better understand how resources were used. So I think organizations are wise to continue to be very cautious and maintain open engagements with their donors on this issue. To that end, and I'm about to hand it over to Dustin, the UK government recently issued new guidance on how humanitarian organizations, particularly those working in high-risk areas, should see British counterterrorism law. And it's a really fascinating document in terms of how a donor government that does not want to implement exemptions and does not appear to want to change its law advises organizations that they fund or that are on their territory as to how to deal with this question. Over to you, Dustin, on the Ukraine issue.
Thanks, Naz. So the general answer is that Resolution 2178 is agnostic with respect to territory. In the key operating paragraphs, it doesn't apply only with respect to Syria, Iraq, Libya, or other places that might more commonly be reported on to raise the FTF-related considerations. But more specifically, so far as I've seen in the at least public reporting in the press on this, it's more a question of whether or not a situation of armed conflict has a tie to some of the groups of focus. There are 70 plus, maybe 77 or so Groups that have been recognized as associated with al-Qaeda and the subject to the 1267 1989 resolution, anti-arms trafficking, anti-travel, anti-financial assistance sanctions. And so whether any of those organizations are operating with respect to Ukraine, I don't know. Whether or not any of the 300 or so individuals on that list are operating with respect to the Ukraine, I don't know. But my understanding is the way that the Security Council has approached it so far is that they're agnostic with respect to the territories where the conflicts are occurring that implicate FTF, and rather are focusing on preventing and suppressing people from traveling to any conflict involving those types of terrorist acts that would be implicated by the resolution, or those types of training that would be undertaken with respect to it. So unfortunately, I wish I knew more about whether or not the Security Council has designated any of those groups and whether they're operating with respect to Ukraine. I'll look into that right now and see if I can pull it up. But overall, I think it's agnostic with respect to the actual territory itself, and more trying to prevent a set of conduct and to penalize that conduct if it actually occurs. Back over to you, Herod.
All right, great. Thanks again to both of you. I think we are going to wrap things up as we're a little bit over time, but I see there's still a really active conversation back and forth happening in the chat, which is fantastic. I'll close from my end by saying that we are going to be gathering up all of the resources that have been suggested, the various links and so on, and putting those together as well into the follow-up email from the event that we'll send you, together with the link to the recording. So hope that that will be useful, and would also really like to underscore a note that was given by Naz at the beginning. But if you have any feedback or follow-up questions, or would like to, for example, request a follow-up event, a discussion on a related topic, please do let us know, or at PHAP, or let PILAC know, and we'll see what we can organize in that regard in the new year. So before we end, I'll just ask our colleagues over in Cambridge if you'd like to take the floor, perhaps first Dustin, and then Naz for any brief closing remarks. Back to you.
Thanks so much, and Herod, in the interest of time, I think I'll take the liberty of speaking on behalf of both of us. Just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for participating. Thanks for the robust chat, and I will say, Omne and I were engaging on this in the chat, but I think it's so important that it merits mentioning. If you are in a context in which there is a sense that engaging with or speaking with representatives of a designated group is being framed as criminal or prohibited, I'd strongly suggest sort of pushing back on that and looking into it further. I think one of perhaps the largest area of confusion that we've encountered on this issue is the misperception that it is unlawful to speak with members of designated groups. And of course, for humanitarian purposes, that is a crucial aspect of your work. So I'll end with what is hopefully a positive note and go back to you in Geneva.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Naz, and thanks for letting us end with that point. Absolutely a really important point that often comes up in these discussions, and important to underline. So with that, we'll be signing off here from Geneva, wishing everyone a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. And unless we speak with you within the next few weeks, a very happy beginning to the new year, and we look forward to seeing you again soon, either online or in person somewhere around the world. That's it for now. Signing off, and Herod Lang from Geneva. Bye-bye.